For other forms of development, see development. International development or global development is a wide concept concerning level of development on an international scale. It is the basis for international classifications such as developed country, developing country and least developed country. There are, however, many schools of thought and conventions regarding which are the exact features constituting development of a country. Historically, it has been largely synonymous with economic development. Recently, it is also often used in a holistic and multidisciplinary context of human development as well as other concepts like competitiveness, quality of life or subjective well-being. International development is different from simple development in that it is specifically composed of institutions and policies that arose after the Second World War. These institutions focus on alleviating poverty and improving living conditions in previously colonized countries. History. Although international relations and international trade have existed for many hundreds of years, it is only in the past century that international development theory emerged as a separate body of ideas. More specifically, it has been suggested that the theory and practice of development is inherently technocratic, and remains rooted in the high modernist period of political thought that existed in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. Throughout the 20th century, before the concept of international development became a common word, four aspects were used to describe the idea: political and economic liberalism, and the significance of free markets; social evolution in extremely hierarchized environment; Marxist critiques of class and imperialism; anti-colonial take on cultural differences and national self-determination. Post-World War II, the second half of the 20th century has been called the era of development. The origins of this era have been attributed to the need for reconstruction in the immediate aftermath of World War II, the evolution of colonialism or colonization into globalization, and the establishment of new free trade policies between so-called developed and underdeveloped nations. The start of the Cold War and the desire of the United States and its allies to prevent the Third World from drifting towards communism. International development in its very meaning is geared towards colonies that gained independence. The governance of the newly independent states should be constructed so that the inhabitants enjoy freedom from poverty, hunger, and insecurity. It has been argued that this era was launched on January 20, 1949, when Harry S. Truman made these remarks in his inaugural address. Before this date, however, the United States had already taken a leading role in the creation of the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development and the International Monetary Fund, both established in 1944, and in the United Nations in 1945. The launch of the Marshall Plan was another important step in setting the agenda for international development, combining humanitarian goals with the creation of a political and economic bloc in Europe that was allied to the US. This agenda was given conceptual support during the 1950s in the form of modernization theory espoused by Walt Rostow and other American economists. The changes in the developed world's approach to international development were further necessitated by the gradual collapse of Western Europe's empires over the next decades. Now independent ex-colonies no longer received support in return for their subordinate role. By the late 1960s, dependency theory arose analyzing the evolving relationship between the West and the Third World. In the 1970s and early 1980s, the modernists at the World Bank and IMF adopted the neoliberal ideas of economists such as Milton Friedman or Bela Balasser, which were implemented in the form of structural adjustment programs, while their opponents were promoting various bottom-up approaches. ranging from civil disobedience and conscientization to appropriate technology and rapid rural appraisal. In response, various parts of the UN system led a counter-movement, which in the long run has proved to be successful. They were led initially by the International Labour Organization, influenced by Paul Streeton, then by UNICEF, then UNDP, even though headed by a conservative U.S. Republican, put forward the concept of human development, thanks to Mahbub-ul Haq and Amartya Sen, thus changing the nature of the development dialogue to focus on human needs and capabilities. By the 1990s, there were some writers for whom development theory had reached an impasse, and some academics were imagining a post-development era. The Cold War had ended, capitalism had become the dominant mode of social organization, and UN statistics showed that living standards around the world had improved over the past 40 years. Nevertheless, a large portion of the world's population were still living in poverty. Their governments were crippled by debt, and concerns about the environmental impact of globalization were rising. In response to the impasse, the rhetoric of development is now focusing on the issue of poverty, with the meta-narrative of modernization being replaced by shorter-term vision embodied by the Millennium Development Goals and the Human Development Approach. At the same time, some development agencies are exploring opportunities for public-private partnerships and promoting the idea of corporate social responsibility, with the apparent aim of integrating international development with the process of economic globalization. The critics have suggested that this integration has always been part of the underlying agenda of development. They argue that poverty can be equated with powerlessness, and that the way to overcome poverty is through emancipatory social movements and civil society, not paternalistic aid programs or corporate charity. This approach is embraced by organizations such as the Gamelan Council, seeking to empower entrepreneurs. While some critics have been debating the end of development, others have predicted a development revival as part of the war on terrorism. To date, however, there is limited evidence to support the notion that aid budgets are being used to counter Islamic fundamentalism in the same way that they were used 40 years ago to counter communism. Theories. There are a number of theories about how desirable change in society is best achieved. Such theories draw on a variety of social scientific disciplines and approaches, and include historical theories such as modernization theory, dependency theory, world systems theory, Millennium Development Goals. In 2000, United Nations signed the United Nations Millennium Declaration, which includes 8 Millennium Development Goals to be achieved by 2015 or 2020. This represented the first time that a holistic strategy to meet the development needs of the world has been established, with measurable targets and defined indicators. Because the MDGs were agreed as global targets to be achieved by the global community, they are independent of, but by no means unrelated to, individual national interests. The goals imply that every state has a set of obligations to the world community to meet, and that other states, who have achieved those goals, have an obligation to help those who have not. As such, they may represent an extension of the concept of human rights. The first 7 Millennium Development Goals present measurable goals, while the 8th lists a number of stepping stone goals, ways in which progress towards the first 7 goals could be made. Each goal uses indicators based on statistical series collected and maintained by respected organizations in each relevant field. The MDGs have catalyzed a significant amount of action, including new initiatives such as Millennium Promise. Most of these initiatives, however, work in small-scale interventions which do not reach the millions of people required by the MDGs. Recent praise has been that it will be impossible to meet the first 7 goals without meeting the 8th by forming a global partnership for development. No current organization has the capacity to dissolve the enormous problems of the developing world alone, especially in cities. where an increasing number of poor people live, as demonstrated by the almost non-existent progress on the goal of improving the lives of at least 100 million slum dwellers. The Institution of Civil Engineers Engineering Without Frontiers panel and its recommendations, and the 2007 Brunel Lecture by the ICE's 2009-2010 President Paul Jowett, a representative of a change of approach in the UK, at least to start drawing together the huge capacity available to Western governments, industry, academia and charity to develop such a partnership. Other goals. International development also aims to improve general government policies of these developing countries. State building is the strengthening of regional institutions necessary to support long-term economic, social, and political development. Education is another important aspect of international development. It is a good example of how the focus today is on sustainable development in these countries. Education gives people the skills required to keep themselves out of poverty.